It wasn't the noise that caused the problem. It was the absence of it. The room was exactly as it should have been, the lights steady, the air systems humming softly in the background, devices awake, listening, waiting, nothing broken, nothing offline, and yet something was missing. You didn't speak, not because you refused to, not because you were hiding anything. There simply wasn't anything to say. A pause between thoughts, a moment of quiet, the kind of silence that had once passed without notice. This time, it didn't. Silence stood out more than noise ever could. In a world trained to expect constant signals, constant feedback, constant confirmation, quiet became an anomaly. The system registered it immediately. Microphones stayed open longer than usual. Ambient sound levels were recalibrated. Background noise was filtered, isolated, dismissed, until all that remained was the unmistakable shape of nothing. No voice, no response, no reassurance. Before anyone in the room noticed, the system reacted. A background process triggered. A confidence interval narrowed. A behavioral expectation went unmet. You didn't hear any of this happen. There was no alert to warn you that the silence had been noticed. No message requesting clarification. No prompt encouraging you to speak. That came later. In the moment itself, the system didn't need explanation. Silence wasn't interpreted as rest or reflection. It was interpreted as absence. And in systems designed to monitor behavior, absence is never neutral. By the time the room filled with sound again, the faint shuffle of movement, the soft return of everyday noise, the system had already logged the quiet as a deviation, a missing signal, the sound that never came. And once something is recorded as missing, the system begins searching for reasons why. Listening didn't become mandatory overnight. It arrived disguised as convenience. At first, always-on microphones were framed as helpers, passive features built into devices people already trusted, smart assistants that responded instantly, homes that adjusted themselves to your voice, cars that listened for stress, fatigue, urgency. The technology promised to remove friction from everyday life. You wouldn't have to press buttons. You wouldn't have to repeat yourself. You wouldn't have to explain. The system would just know. People welcomed it because it felt optional. You could mute it, turn it off, use it when you wanted. And when you did, it worked. Commands were understood. Emergencies were detected faster. Accidents were prevented. Lives, in some cases, were genuinely saved. That mattered. Safety became the strongest argument. If microphones could hear a fall, they could call for help. If they could detect panic in a voice, they could intervene. If they could recognize distress before it escalated, they could prevent harm. Listening wasn't surveillance, it was protection. Then came clarity. Meetings were transcribed perfectly, misunderstandings reduced, conversations analyzed for tone, intent, emotional state. The system didn't just hear what was said, it interpreted how it was said. Silence, hesitation, uncertainty, all smoothed out by algorithmic context. Communication became cleaner, faster, more efficient. And slowly, listening stopped being a feature and started becoming an assumption. Platforms worked better when microphones were active. Services became more responsive. Systems felt smarter. Turning listening off didn't break anything. It just made everything worse, slower, less accurate, less personalized. Disabling microphones wasn't prohibited, it was inconvenient. Support systems warned you that safety features would be limited. Work tools reminded you that clarity might be reduced. Public spaces encouraged audio access for optimal experience. Most people didn't question it, because nothing bad happened when you complied. The system listened constantly, but it didn't interrupt. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand. It simply waited, quietly, patiently, for sound. And in a world where safety, convenience, and clarity were treated as necessities, being heard became less important than being audible. By the time anyone realized that listening was no longer optional, the idea of silence had already begun to feel like a risk. Speech became reassurance long before anyone realized it. At first, it was subtle. Systems responded more smoothly when voices were present. Interfaces felt more stable. Processes completed faster when there was audible confirmation. A greeting, a command, a casual remark spoken aloud. Silence introduced hesitation, so people began to talk, not to each other, but to the systems around them. A comment while working, a response to an automated prompt, a quiet acknowledgement that they were present, engaged, functioning as expected. Speech became a signal. If you spoke regularly, the system interpreted you as active, responsive, aligned. A steady stream of voice data suggested emotional stability and cognitive normality. Tone, cadence, volume, rhythm, all of it was measured and compared against established baselines. Voice data didn't need context. It didn't care what you meant. It cared how you sounded. A calm tone indicated regulation. A steady pace suggested clarity. Minor fluctuations were tolerated. Everyone had bad days, but prolonged deviations raised questions. Intent, once inferred through action and choice, became inefficient. It required interpretation. It invited error. Voice patterns were cleaner, easier to analyze, easier to predict. So intent was replaced, not officially, not in policy language, but in practice. Healthy communication was no longer about honesty or understanding. It wasn't about connection or expression. It became about consistency, maintaining a vocal presence that fit within acceptable ranges. People learned this instinctively. They filled quiet moments with harmless commentary, spoke aloud while thinking, reassured the room with their voice, even when no one else was there. Because speaking felt safer than not speaking. Silence created gaps in the data. Gaps made profiles unstable. Unstable profiles required attention. So people talked, not because they had something to say, but because speech had become proof that nothing was wrong. In a system that equated sound with normality, the absence of voice wasn't peaceful. It was suspicious. Silence was never meant to be meaningful. In earlier systems, it was treated as empty space, a neutral absence between signals. But once listening became continuous, quiet stopped being empty. It became measurable. And anything measurable can be evaluated. The system flagged quiet because it disrupted expectation. Always-on microphones were trained on constant input, background noise, casual speech, environmental sound, routine confirmations. These patterns formed a baseline, a steady acoustic signature of normal life. Silence broke that signature. Not the natural kind, a room settling at night, a pause in conversation, but prolonged quiet. Pauses that didn't resolve into speech, gaps that extended just long enough to stand out. The system didn't interpret silence emotionally. It interpreted it statistically. How long did the pause last? How often did it occur? What usually followed similar gaps in other profiles? Pauses were measured in milliseconds, then seconds, then patterns. A brief silence was tolerated. Repeated silence was noted. Extended silence triggered recalibration. The absence of sound wasn't judged on its own. It was compared against your past behavior, against others like you, against projected norms. If you used to speak regularly and stopped, the deviation mattered. If your environment was usually noisy and suddenly quiet, the contrast mattered. Quiet became context, and context became signal. The system began to treat silence the way it once treated errors, not as failure, but as information, a missing data point that suggested uncertainty, withdrawal, unresponsiveness, possibly distress, possibly concealment, possibly nothing at all, but possibility was enough. Because in systems designed to reduce risk, uncertainty is treated as something to be resolved. So, the absence of sound triggered subtle responses. Listening windows extended, sensitivity increased, filters tightened, separating ambient noise from intentional quiet. The system leaned in, trying to hear what wasn't there. And when nothing came, that nothing was recorded. Silence was no longer just the lack of speech. It became a behavioral anomaly, a signal defined not by what was said, but by what wasn't. And once silence could be detected, measured, and compared, it stopped being peaceful. It became something the system felt compelled to understand. The first flag was designed not to be noticed. If it were obvious, it would provoke questions. If it felt punitive, it would invite resistance. So the system responded the same way it always did, by helping. Nothing felt wrong at first. The environment remained familiar. Devices behaved normally. There were no alerts demanding explanation, no notifications warning of abnormal behavior. Silence didn't trigger confrontation. It triggered adjustment. Listening windows stayed open longer. Prompts became slightly more frequent. System responses slowed just enough to encourage interaction. It felt like a technical quirk, a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing people blame on updates or network delays and forget about moments later. That was intentional. Behind the scenes, your profile shifted by a fraction too small to register. A confidence score dipped. A stability metric recalculated. Your behavior wasn't labeled dangerous or non-compliant. It was labeled incomplete. The system didn't flag you for being silent. It flagged you for being unreadable. Silence created gaps in the data, and gaps weakened predictions. Weakened predictions required intervention. Not correction, just closer attention. So the system adapted. Your interactions were monitored more carefully. Your environment was categorized as higher variance. Future expectations adjusted to account for the possibility that you might not respond when prompted. None of this changed what you were allowed to do. It changed how much trust the system extended while you did it. That's why nothing felt officially wrong. You still had access, still moved freely, still spoke when you wanted to. The system didn't take anything away. It simply began watching more closely. And that's how the first flag works. It doesn't announce itself. It quietly rewrites who the system believes you are, replacing certainty with caution. By the time you sense that something has shifted, the flag has already done its job, and the version of you the system is now tracking is no longer the one you thought you were presenting. At first, people thought talking more would make things easier. If silence was being noticed, then sound became protection. A casual comment, a quiet response, a steady stream of small, harmless confirmations to reassure the system that everything was normal. So, people filled the quiet. They narrated their actions, responded to prompts that didn't require answers, spoke aloud while working, not for clarity, but for presence. The sound of their own voice became proof that they were still participating. But constant expression has a cost. When you can't go quiet, your mind never fully rests. Thoughts that once stayed internal now felt risky to keep unspoken. Silence, even brief, carried weight. It suggested withdrawal, uncertainty, absence. So people performed normality instead. They learned the right tone, calm, steady, neutral, not too emotional, not too flat. They learned which phrases sounded reassuring and which introduced ambiguity, which pauses were acceptable and which lingered too long. Every conversation became a low-level performance. The exhaustion didn't come from speaking. It came from maintaining the correct version of yourself at all times. There was no space to trail off mid-thought, no room for long pauses to process ideas. Thinking out loud, once a way to explore, to question, to doubt, became dangerous. Doubt sounded like instability. Hesitation sounded like confusion. And confusion attracted attention. So people stopped exploring ideas verbally, stopped questioning aloud, stopped allowing thoughts to unfold naturally in sound. Internal dialogue became tightly controlled, compressed, filtered before it ever reached the air. The irony was cruel. Speech had once been a way to connect, to express uncertainty, to seek understanding. Now it was a tool for reassurance, not for others, but for the system. The quiet moments where people used to discover what they actually thought began to disappear. Not because anyone forbade them, but because staying audible felt safer than being silent. And in a world where silence was suspicious, the simplest form of mental rest, going quiet, became something most people no longer trusted themselves to do. The room stayed quiet longer than it should have, not unnaturally quiet, not alarmingly still, just absent of the small, habitual sounds that usually filled the space, a comment spoken without thinking, a response offered out of routine, the low reassurance of a human voice confirming presence. Nothing came. The system waited. It always did. Microphones remained open. Sensitivity increased slightly. Background noise was filtered, then filtered again, until all that remained was the steady outline of silence. No speech, no incidental sound, no vocal confirmation that someone was there, engaged, functioning as expected. You didn't notice the time passing. That was the mistake. There was no moment where you consciously decided not to speak. No internal warning telling you that quiet had become dangerous. You were simply thinking, processing, letting a thought settle before giving it shape. A voice never came, and that absence stretched just long enough to matter. Somewhere beyond the room, a threshold was crossed. Not dramatically, not with urgency, just enough to trigger a response that had been waiting patiently for a reason to exist. The system didn't register panic, it didn't register refusal, it registered non-response. A deviation from expected vocal behavior. The room remained calm. The lights didn't change. No prompt interrupted your thoughts. There was no request to speak, no reminder to engage. The incident passed without announcement. But when the silence finally broke, when you spoke again, casually, naturally, it didn't undo what had already been recorded. The system doesn't evaluate recovery. It evaluates the moment where certainty disappeared. And in that quiet second, when a voice should have been there and wasn't, the system decided that something about you required closer attention. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you didn't do anything at all. You didn't say anything wrong. There was nothing you could point to, no sentence taken out of context, no word flagged as inappropriate, no tone analysis that crossed a line. You didn't say anything wrong because you didn't say anything at all. And by the standards people were used to, that should have been fine. No rule had been violated, no guideline ignored, no instruction disobeyed. Silence, after all, was never listed as an offense. There was no policy that required you to speak within a certain number of seconds, no regulation mandating constant verbal confirmation. That's what made the consequences so difficult to understand, because they still came, not immediately, not dramatically, but with the same quiet precision the system applied to everything else. Processes slowed, responses became more cautious, certain interactions required additional clarification, others simply felt less responsive, as if the system was hesitating around you. The system never accused you of withholding information. It didn't need to. Compliance systems aren't built around guilt. Guilt assumes intention, emotion, and explanation. Those things are inefficient. They require debate, interpretation, uncertainty. Absence is cleaner. When sound is expected and doesn't arrive, the system doesn't ask why. It asks how often. It treats silence the same way it treats missing data, as a gap that weakens confidence, and weakened confidence triggers safeguards. From the system's perspective, your silence wasn't peaceful or reflective. It was incomplete input, an interruption in the behavioral stream that made prediction less reliable. And in environments governed by prediction, unreliability is the one condition that demands response. So the system adjusted, not to punish you, but to reduce exposure. When compliance systems interpret absence, they don't see restraint or thoughtfulness. They see uncertainty. And uncertainty, when scaled, becomes risk. That's why nothing had to be said for something to change. You didn't say anything wrong. You simply failed to provide the reassurance the system had come to depend on. And once that reassurance was missing, the system responded the only way it knows how, by tightening its grip, quietly, around the space where your voice used to be. The mark didn't announce itself. There was no label you could see, no notification explaining what had changed. Life continued with the same surfaces, the same interfaces, the same language of normality. And yet, something about the way the system responded to you felt different, quieter. When you were labeled unresponsive, access didn't disappear, it hesitated. Requests that once completed instantly now paused, as if waiting for reassurance that never quite arrived. Prompts asked for confirmation more often. Interfaces lingered, encouraging you to speak, to acknowledge, to fill the silence before moving on. Silence began to limit access not because it was forbidden, but because it reduced confidence. The system preferred users who produced steady, predictable signals. Voices meant presence. Presence meant reliability. Without that constant stream of audio confirmation, your profile carried more uncertainty, and uncertainty required containment. So, options narrowed. Not in obvious ways, nothing was denied outright. You could still navigate, still request, still participate, but the range of possibilities offered to you shrank. Recommendations became conservative. Permissions were scoped more tightly. Opportunities that required trust or autonomy simply stopped appearing. The system didn't say no, it stopped saying yes. Choices that once felt open now came pre-filtered, pre-approved, pre-shaped. Paths that involved ambiguity, initiative, or silence were quietly avoided on your behalf. The future became safer, simpler, and smaller. Social interactions changed, too. Conversations routed through systems felt more structured, more guided. Moments of natural quiet were filled with automated prompts, reminders, suggestions to engage. The space to simply exist without commentary grew thin. You began to notice how often you were being nudged to speak, to confirm, to acknowledge, to reassure. Because reassurance restored access. That was the lesson the system taught without ever stating it. Life after the quiet mark wasn't about restriction. It was about reduction. A gradual narrowing of choices until the easiest path, the one that kept you audible, predictable, responsive, was the only one that remained. And in that world, silence didn't just feel risky, it felt expensive. Quiet didn't become dangerous because people had something to hide. It became dangerous because silence couldn't be measured. In systems built on prediction, anything that resists measurement becomes a liability. Sound provides data. Data creates certainty. Certainty allows control to operate smoothly, without friction or doubt. Silence offers none of that. So quiet was redefined, not as rest or reflection, but as absence. An interruption in the behavioral stream, a gap the system couldn't easily fill with probability. That's why it had to be addressed. There was a time when privacy had a sound. It was the pause before a thought, the quiet of a room where no one was listening, the space between words where meaning was still forming. Privacy used to sound like nothing at all, But systems that demand a response don't tolerate nothing. They require confirmation, reassurance, evidence that you are present, engaged, and behaving within expected bounds. They don't need you to agree with them. They don't need you to confess. They don't even need you to understand. They only need you to speak. Because the moment you go quiet, the moment the room stays still and your voice doesn't arrive, is the moment uncertainty enters the system. And uncertainty is the one thing predictive control cannot allow to remain unresolved. That is the final truth. When silence becomes a risk, it isn't because quiet is harmful. It's because silence is the last place freedom can still hide.